Howdy, folks. Chris Sheets here, and welcome to episode 60 of the Right to Roam podcast. Today's guest is Len Necefer. He's a member of the Navajo Nation and assistant professor at the University of Arizona. We keep wanting to dive into more wildlife and biological and scientific discussions, but along our journey, we keep running into folks, great folks at that, who can bring the human component into the discussion, which by all measures is an integral part of the landscape level equation that is ecology. And I think this is one of those episodes that the lines blur pretty effectively. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation.
When fences don't exist to hamper the telling of stories or hinder the wanderlust our public lands promote, the result is an inherent right to roam. Right to Roam is an outdoors-oriented podcast that focuses on the conservation of our public lands and the myriad of resources that abound within those wild spaces. The balance between science and anecdote is a fine one, which is why Lee, Sam, Chris, and Adam, your hosts, and their guests rely heavily on the mantra, "You're entitled to your own opinion, not your own facts."
They could essentially, the guy that I talked to, they would talk about it as if like walking down aisles in the grocery store, because they could go to this canyon for acorns, or they could go to this other one for like shoots of early plants or whatever it may be. And they basically use the landscape to their advantage, as a form of management.
So, Len, this what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to a lot of this is out of our wheelhouse.
Sweet.
So, I'm going to let you just put on a lecture, man.
Sounds good.
So,
and then we'll ask probably very dumb questions.
You sent me a list of a handful of the topics, and I'm like, yeah, all of them, but there's no way to get through all of those, I don't think. And then I'm going through your CV here on LinkedIn, and I'm like, who is this guy? Is this the same guy whose house I stayed at?
Yeah. I had a whole life before this, what I'm doing now. So.
Oh, really? Obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're looking at, I haven't even looked. I kind of just post climbing photos on my LinkedIn just to sort of shame my old colleagues.
Yeah, that's
rub their noses in it. No, I'm kidding. I
don't think you are.
And I don't see a problem with it. So
no, I mean, it's I think one of the pieces, I grew up, outdoors as a kid, and I actually gave a lecture on this morning, but I came from a family of traditional healers. Like my mom's side of the family, they were medicine people, and we hunted and gathered herbs and whatever. So I mean, we're just outside basically just to live. So that was always my context of being outdoors, and I don't know, going to school was cool, but I wasn't the best student per se. I definitely kind of had a wild streak, and so I always kind of enjoyed recess more than any other.
Well, I think we all did, but if you were a bad student, I was a miserable student because I barely got through a 4-year degree, much less my PhD.
Yeah. It was kind of... So anyways, yeah, I mean, I was just talking about the work I'm doing now. I'm basically just finding sort of a better way to educate folks that can include being outside. I think if university experiences are more embedded in the outdoors and that experience, I think it'll be a lot more healthy and relevant to students as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We haven't spoken of this quite to an extent, actually. Adam and I have about just primary education and secondary education, where a lot of that's lacking, especially with standardized testing kind of being you start seeing recess getting shorter, and if kids aren't connecting, and students even at the college age, it's hard to get them engaged as adults when they actually are voting and so
it's a real thing.
For those of you who haven't put this together yet, Our guest tonight is Len Necefer. Is that how I say that? Is that?
Yeah, Necefer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you never actually told me your last name. So I met Len on a hunt down in Arizona about a month and a half ago.
Right.
And we ended up, you picked us, or Mating Patelis up and myself at the airport, and we slept in your basement, and the next morning we left. And I was like, I'm going to have this guy on, man.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Yeah, it's awesome. I know I've crossed paths with Martin quite a bit, and Jess. So it's cool to see all you all coming down here to check out the Coos deer.
Where is she not?
Yeah, you guys met, yeah, right? I mean, dude, yeah. If she's got like the
47 jobs.
The biggest case of FOMO I've ever met. Like, if there's something cool going on, she'll be there.
She's doing it.
Yeah, she really will. I think she and I have that similar streak, so that's why we cross paths quite a bit.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, and you guys met at Shift in Jackson, right? You want to maybe tell folks a little bit about that? And
then, so I'm on the board for the Center for Jackson Hole, is a organization that has put on the Shift conference for the past 4 years, but the whole thrust of the conference is talking about bringing together the many stakeholders in public lands and conservation to have basically a very wide cross-section of folks talking about similar issues. And so it's been really cool to have folks from cities to hunters to native people to, just a whole mix of folks. And a big component of this is a thing called the Emerging Leaders Program. And that has brought together about 20 young people every year that are really making differences in sort of strives in conservation or outdoor rec or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
So sort of uses of public lands. And that's where Jess and I met.
Yeah.
And we were in the same cohort, 2 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, it was really awesome. So we connected there, and it's, this year, this conference, the last year's conference was looking at public health, and this year we're going to look at it again. But I think when, looking at the opportunities that presents, it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, because if you connect it to things like, where do we get our food? I mean, in a way, the food we eat is medicine.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it's like connecting that with then being physically active to get the food or whatever it may be, at recreating. There's these sort of intersections of public health that are very relevant. And the other piece is, I mean, you look at the healthcare industry in this country, it's massive. And there's a lot of opportunity to potentially leverage conservation gains from a public health perspective as well.
Well, can I steal the segue from you a little bit? Because I want to go back and kind of establish, you touched on it just a little bit, your heritage and your upbringing, Len,
Yep.
and that gives you a perspective that most Americans don't have.
Yeah.
If you just elaborate on that a little bit, give us a little history, background, familial lineage, that sort of thing, that'd be kind of cool.
So my mom is from the Navajo Nation, a place called Red Valley, Arizona. It's right on the border of Arizona and New Mexico in the Four Corners region area.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad is Romanian Scottish, second generation on both sides. So I knew my great grandparents from like all three of those families. And it was always a kind of a neat, I don't know, it's kind of a very unique cultural upbringing, having those sort of very different lineages. But my mom's side of the family were, my grandfather was a traditional healer, and we had sheep and cattle, horses. My grandpa and my uncle would hunt, and so it was just people that lived off the land. And so that was largely my upbringing. And so I did a lot of ceremonial practices as well. And if I were to say ceremonial practices, it's more like my grandpa was a doctor, and like he basically went out into the woods and got medicine from different plants to heal people.
Okay, yeah. So I'm trying to think of how to get transition back to this. So
just do it.
I'm trying to think of how to do it. Like, I guess
steamroll it.
Tactfully.
Steamroll it.
Here I go, guys.
Man.
I don't know, words are coming out. So you had mentioned the Shift conference, right? And you kind of started off by talking about trying to get everybody from all perspectives in the conversation about public lands and health, and that's obviously something that you're very passionate about. I'm looking through your I just Googled your name online before we got started, and I mean, you really care about this. You're CEO and founder of a company called Native Outdoors, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And also founder and CEO of Diversity Outdoors, or Diversify Outdoors. Excuse me.
I'm not the founder and CEO of that. I'm just involved.
Oh, that's just your. Yeah, there you go. But anyways, you're connected with that. And that is also a social media platform of like bloggers and.
Yeah, it was like companies and organizations that are trying to increase like a broader cross section of this country and public lands and being outside.
Yeah.
For me, like, I'm most concerned, like right now, looking at. I grew up in a rural area. I lived in the cities for over a decade. But one of the things that I'm seeing now is just a lot of folks don't spend a lot of time outside. And when we're talking about natural spaces, the environment, it's hard to expect people to care about conservation or hunting and fishing issues if they don't have any stake in the environment. Yeah. And if you look in urban areas, it's often African American, Latino, and Native American communities. Actually, most Native people live in urban areas now. Yeah. But if those folks don't have a stake in the outdoors and caring about outside, or don't have access to doing that, then it's basically losing an entire generation of folks that, could potentially
cultural.
When we recorded a podcast with the group when we were down there in Arizona for that Coos deer hunt, and Motting said something that I had never really thought of because I live in a small bubble here in northern Wyoming. But we were in there, talking about conservation and issues and the environment and things of that effect, very similar to what we just spoke about. But he said this is a privileged thing. Like, to have the opportunity and even have the energy and the education to even know to care about this, like, it's a white privilege thing. And I'm not trying to pull the white privilege card, but I never really thought of that.
I don't know that there's very many times you get to pull that and be halfway proud about it.
But you're right, yeah, exactly. But when you're speaking to the fact that a lot of Native Americans, who I think that when you think hunting and fishing and hunting and gathering, that's the first thing that comes to most people's mind is that image.
Right.
And even to that extent, a lot of those cultures are separated from the environment, even on, I think, some of the reservations. And that's a whole other conversation about how we got to that point. But moving forward, it looks like you're part of that conversation. And I think that's super cool, because if we're going to move the needle, everybody's got to be on board in this country. I mean, and I don't care who you are, how you vote. It doesn't matter to me. Your ethnicity, none of that matters. So
it doesn't matter to me either. I mean, at the end of the day, if we care about protecting the same place or taking care of the same place, I think one of preserving the things, how they've been for 10,000 years, like Native people have lived on these lands sustainably. And I think it's just, we're writing the next chapter, and there's a bit of learning that we're having to do in the process, but
there's a cultural gap, I'm assuming, for a lot of
and I don't think that the gap is that big. I think it's very attainable. And I think once people feel like their identity is tied to a land, then it's like, that's half the battle's over.
This conversation's taking a social engineering route that I wasn't expecting.
Hey man, but you're figuring out my plan.
But I do have a point of view or a perspective on this that kind of I think, and at least my understanding, identifies the problem, that we have become such a quick access, everything's right at our fingertips. I mean, we're speaking via the convenience of the internet and computers right now, but we are constantly packing that instant gratification with us. And things about nature are hard. You don't go out and find natural herbs and medicines like you do going to the grocery store or the pharmacy. You don't, or shopping on Amazon.
That wasn't my upbringing, man.
I hunted morels. That was as close to chasing down wild, crazy herbs as I got.
It's kind of funny, because I was just talking to my students today about some traditional hunting and gathering techniques, and giving examples of different Native people around the world that have basically done ecosystem modification to increase food production. So one of the examples that I didn't give in class, but I'll give now, is the Ohlone people, which is the people that live in the Bay Area traditionally. there's a number of canyons that run out of the San Francisco area that, you know, in the 1900s or 19th century and 18th century, that they would burn these canyons they would basically stagger the burns across different seasons. And then as these burn areas would recover, there would be different foods that would come into them. So they could essentially, the guy that I talked to, they would talk about it as if like walking down aisles in the grocery store.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, because they could go to this canyon for acorns, or they could go to this other one for like shoots of early plants or whatever it may be. And they basically use the landscape to their advantage, you know, as a form of management for
Absolutely.
sure.
I've heard, I read a foraging book, because this is something that really interested me. You know, I think as a kid you read like My Side of the Mountain, Far Side of the Mountain, Hatchet. You know, just some of the books I read. It's like, man, I'm going to do it. I'm going to drop off the grid and I'm going to do this. You know, but I've always been interested in trying to how to be more efficient as an outdoorsman. But I read a quote from a book on foraging, the Rocky Mountain West, and they said something to the effect that nature is a bountiful table. They're just really long tables.
Yeah.
And you can get everything you need, but it just comes in like chunks throughout the year. You know, but it's all there. You just have to know how to prepare and be a couple steps ahead of like the successional patterns and you know, weather and stochastic events, but it's all there. But it's not like just go out tomorrow and get everything you need for the winter.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. It's like I did some freelancing like the past couple years before I took this job at the university, and it was akin to like hunting and gathering. It was like felt like feast or famine, you know? It's like, wow, this is the modern iteration of that.
Yeah, for sure. So what are some of the courses that you actually teach right now as a professor? Yeah.
So my role is like so the tenure track assistant professor. So like I have like 40% of my work is research, 40% is teaching, and 20% is service, which is like service to the local community. So I do quite a bit of research, and the teaching load this year I've had is pretty minimal. So I teach one course now. It's called Many Nations of Native America, but it's just a general gen ed course for like freshmen or folks just looking for, I don't want to say an easy 3-credit hour course, but like it's a general education course, you know. So
I remember taking like intro to anthropology. It sounds very similar to that.
Yeah, it's basically that, and you know, it's focusing on the indigenous people of North America. So everywhere from like northern Canada, Alaska, down to like Central America. It's kind of where we focus. It's been fun, but you know, like a lot of our class thus far has been just talking, like today we talked about traditional ecological knowledge and just basically the system of scientific knowledge that indigenous people have from just living on the land for a long time. And how that's transmitted. And it was cool to see like students that aren't into like one student that I know was a vegan was really into the lecture, because it just, I don't know. I mean, it's a different way of looking at the environment, as instead of I don't know. It was good. It was a cool course, and it's like been fun to just kind of, I don't know.
Well, we've spoke to this a few times about, how do I say this, about proper rangeland management, as far as if you go back 3 or 4 generations for a rancher, maybe 5 or 6 in some parts of the country, for, you know, families that have been making a living off the landscape, whether that's ranching or farming, that's pretty short, right?
Right.
And you talk to some folks that are like, oh, we've been here for generations, I know exactly what's going on, you know, and it's like, man, you have such a snapshot. I mean, granted, like, and there's not even much of a like an oral tradition there, passing things on from great grandfather and like, you know, how to handle the drought and where to stock the cattle. And I'm not saying that these folks don't know their land better than most, but it's nothing compared to what the Native Americans had. And I'm assuming, so was that, I mean, all that knowledge for the most part, I guess depending on the tribe, had it been passed down through oral tradition? Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, you know, it has been passed down orally. And like one of the things that I learned that was kind of, in reflecting of like, oh yeah, that is true as well, is like it's passed down through ceremonial and spiritual practices as well. One of like an example of that is there was some students from Tasmania and Australia visiting U of A today, and I got to talk with them, but they were telling an example I wanted to give in class was about the firehawks. Like, so in Australia, there's been, you know, the raptors that basically
Start fires.
So far, that's anecdotal evidence, right? They don't have anything caught on video. Do they have it proven? Okay.
Yeah, and so the way that it was Western scientists were able to prove it using those methods, but then some anthropologists came and said, hey, well, like these Aboriginal people that have been living on this particular continent for 40,000 years have this entire practice of this raptor embedded in ceremonial practices. Wow. And it's a key part of their belief system is how those raptors behave. It's pretty insane. And I was talking to some of the students today, and they're like, oh yeah, we have our dances and ceremonies to celebrate that part of the raptor, or the hawks and stuff. It was cool.
Well, yeah, sorry. This is the funnest part about doing this podcast is if you pay attention to your guests, you can tie pretty much every conversation to another conversation. Yeah. And I mean, and that's the cool thing about like learning. I'm getting cheesy, but like you can start connecting these dots and the lines start to blur. But Adam's kind of got this infamous line, with our podcast. There's a fine line between science and anecdote, and you kind of need one for the other, and I think they're a perfect complement to each other. But that's the actually, if I were to give the best example of like what traditional ecological knowledge looks like, I don't want to say it's anecdote, but it's like learned experience over many generations, but it doesn't have like sort of the approach that say Western science does of like proving and testing hypotheses, right? So but I think that's like the values. I'm reading a book right now on the value systems in science and how that works, and but that's very similar, right? I mean, this anecdote is kind of what drives the questions for Western science to answer, right? And that anecdote defines culture, and culture just defines values, and values is what we decide to run through the scientific method. Yep. Sorry, I get so excited. I'm a geek, dude, total geek. So what's some of the research you're doing right now?
I'm doing a few things. I'm doing some stuff around renewable energy in Alaskan Native communities. So looking at how before I started a company and did all these things, like I worked for the Department of Energy for a little bit, and I worked in Alaska specifically with Native communities that are off the road system that rely on diesel generation to generate power. So just for reference, these communities are sometimes paying 14 times for the amount of electricity. It's just it's absurd. And like renewable energy is just it's a great option because it provides energy security and it also reduces cost. And
well, also I think when you have sun 24 hours a day, almost for part of the year, then the rest of the year just blows. I mean, they're kind of in from what I know, they're in a pretty good spot.
Someone needs to figure out solar panels on a windmill for that, and you got it.
We worked on some cool projects. One of them was like so most of the energy demands in Alaska are during the winter. And it's also in some parts of Alaska, like Western Alaska, along the coast, it's the windiest time of year too. So we did a lot of work on wind installations along the coast, and but for a lot of these communities, they're not fully cash economies, and that's a key. There's a key piece of that. We went to one community or worked with one community where they were paying like in the winter, like I think all like their heating, their electricity, their sewer bill, because they have to heat the sewers, like otherwise they'll freeze, and so like the combination of all those bills came out to about $1,600 a month.
Wow.
And you think about a community that's making maybe $25,000 a year per capita, it's like it becomes a big burden, and the trade-off often becomes is that people then have less money to buy gasoline or for hunting. And so if you can free up the resources from paying utilities, it basically means more money to go hunting and fishing. And that's so interesting. My research now is looking at what the energy intensity of traditional hunting and fishing is, and then trying to connect that back to what the actual savings are from energy and renewable energy and energy efficiency from those things. So just trying to provide policymakers hard numbers on this is what the impact is when you put the money into these communities. It's not just it's not just going into nothing.
So pardon my ignorance on this. This is back to my naive perception of Native Americans' way of life. So educate me, put me in my place. I'm assuming that a lot of the traditional methods, you said it costs money, right? Time and money and gas for them to hunt and fish in the current situation. What has changed to get them to that point, culturally and ecologically?
Yeah. Back in the, you're going to hear, this is a great story.
I love it. I'm into it.
And a really great anecdote. But really, back in the 50s and 60s in Canada and Alaska, the most Alaskan Native people were semi-nomadic. They would often have 4 camps that they would cycle to between the seasons, and these were all correlated with fishing, moose camp, like different places to hunt and fish. And so they would move between these camps seasonally. And in the 50s, the United States and Canadian governments thought it'd be, hey, we need to provide you resources since you're poor, and so you have to live in one place. And so they forced a lot of Native people to like live in one place, which is often one of the camps that they just happen to be in. And so, you know, it was a policy and basically imposed a lot on a lot of Native people. One of the great stories of resistance to this policy was in Arctic Bay, which is up in like northern Canada. There's an anthropologist named Wade Davis that was working with a family there, and he has this story about this Inuit man who was refusing to go. Like he's like, hell no, I'm not staying in this village. I'm going to continue living the way I've been living. And so his
we
family,
leave this place for a reason this time of year.
Yep. And so his family took away all his tools and his dog sleds, because they thought he was going to run away. And so the guy in the middle of the night slips out of his igloo, and like he shits in his hand and starts making a knife out of the shit and sharpens it with his saliva. He then takes his shit knife and then goes and butchers one of the dogs, makes a sled out of its rib cage, and then just disappears in the night after hooking it up to a bunch of other dogs. So he like stole people's dogs and ran off into the night. Like, cause he did.
This is a different version of the shit knife story I heard on Joe Rogan. He was talking about the shit knife a while ago, like 2 years ago.
Interesting.
It's pretty hardcore, man.
Yes, that is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a fucking awesome story. But like, so sorry, man. This is like I'm always drawing parallels. But so we've been talking about like consumerism driving conservation, which is an interesting thing in and of itself, because they're kind of dichotomous forces, I guess. But like that right there, it's like he didn't need to go buy a knife. He just took a shit in his hand. It's cold enough. You know what I'm getting at? Like, oh, I have a new Gerber and I'm sponsored.
That's borderline hyperbole.
Oh man.
All anyone has to do is defecate in a mold.
Like, he's probably sitting angry in his igloo, like, I'm gonna get out of here. And he just
I'll show you bastards. Oh, good grief! And the other benefit of a high protein meat based diet.
Yeah, exactly.
Good strong blade consistency.
Good fiber. Yeah. So
holy digression. Anyway.
I'm just the visual in my mind right now is impressive.
Yeah.
Well, Len, what's your PhD in? Out of curiosity.
Engineering and public policy. So
how does the engineering and public policy PhD circle back to a very conservation-centered way of life and current action?
It's if I were to describe it, it's the joke in my department is that they said they beat the social science into the engineers. But a lot of the training was learning how to do technical policy analysis. So the work that I'm doing in Alaska, for example, I'm trying to quantify the energy intensity of basically calorie per calorie for gasoline and meat that is harvested. And so I'm just equipped with the tools to kind of do those estimations and like then create some sort of policy solution from it that's technical in nature and has some sort of outcome like that. So I would say like energy policy, environmental policy is sort of my wheelhouse.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, that's where the rubber meets the road anymore. You have to put in a capitalistic society, for better or worse, you got to put numbers to things to get people's attention. And,
totally.
Some things it feels really shitty to put numbers on. I'm getting on, like, I had to put numbers on, like, justifying conservation and, like, humanity.
Yeah,
like, really, like,
totally.
that kind of
clean water.
That should kind of speak
we have to
for
put a number
itself,
on clean
right?
water, really.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's the thing is, like, it's the way that we make so the piece about the social science is that the way that we do our calculations are largely can be informed by the cultures that we come from. The ways in which the things that we value as intangible or not having value, or things that we value more or less. I mean, these are real societal factors. And I think that's often when you look at some of the conflicts that's happened between indigenous people and energy, like pipelines, for example, that's a really great example of where those value systems can just come into clash.
Yeah, I didn't want to open this, because I think this could be a whole entire podcast, since it is so politically loaded for some people. Back to your values, just kind of giving you bias on where you stand on these things. But bears ears. I mean, everyone's biased to some extent. We all are. But bears ears and standing rock and some of that stuff. It's I think those are really evident there, and of where those values clash, like you said.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, wrong, or indifferent.
Yeah.
And
totally.
And being aware of that is really interesting. And you have done some advising, correct, to some tribes on kind of how to play the game, as far as how to find that balance on tribal land. Is that? I remember we had a discussion like that from the airport. Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah. I've done some work with so the state of Colorado through Luis Benitez's office is the Colorado Office of Outdoor Recreation. I sit on the advisory board for them, but one of the things that we've done through that role is that we've started the conversation with tribes about the outdoor rec and conservation discussion in the state of Colorado. But we, at the last summer outdoor retailer show, we brought together 17 tribes to talk about, just begin the conversation about tribes' participation in the industry. There's some tribes here and there that are doing stuff that, for example, the Southern Ute tribe does some hunting guiding.
Yeah.
The White Mountain Apache are another example of that. There's a couple tribes that own ski resorts, and so there's sort of these examples.
There's a couple of tribes in Montana that do bison hunts.
Yeah, exactly. So there's no sort of coordinated dialogue over that, and for a lot of tribes, the conversation for them is, how do we do sustainable economic development? How do we ensure that our tribal members stay and live in their own communities? And how do we also ensure that when kids and people get outdoors, that it's a form of culture and language preservation?
Yeah.
So so we started that conversation, and it's been really cool. There's one tribe that's looking at starting an office and outdoor rec on their own lands, and starting to look at how they can leverage these different opportunities that they made at the OR show last summer.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a hard turn here, just because I'm thinking about. I'm still kind of marinating on your conversation today in your lecture, where you had an individual who was vegan. Appreciating the culture of hunting through Native Americans' perspective. Is that a fair way to put that?
Yeah. I think seeing that this tradition has been going on for, at least in the case of this one tribe, like 15,000 years.
Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of where I'm getting at, as far as being like, this is, and we're not going to solve this, but this is just an interesting thing that's brewing in my head. But there is a fair amount of people that really have this anti-hunting sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes through the cultural lens of being Native Americans, that, oh well, that's okay, because that's a tradition. And this is a totally loaded statement, but tradition is a tradition is a tradition. It's my family's tradition, and if you look back the tribe you were talking about doing this for 14,000 years, I mean, you could honestly say that hunting is a human tradition for our entire evolution. So it's just interesting, I think, how, I know this isn't a psychology episode, but how people can like partition values and assign that to, what I'm getting at, like a level
weighted
of
merit. They end up assigning political weighted merit to someone's tradition.
Yeah,
totally. I mean, I think the other thing is that some of Native Americans' history is romanticized, and we're kind of you know, that plays into it as well, of like,
Yeah.
oh, they're so sophisticated. It's like, no, man, we're like, it's like you're romanticizing someone going to the grocery store. Like,
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I'm getting at. Is like,
and bypassing the fact that buffalo jumps existed.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
But that would not be an ethical form of harvest today. But if like the
No.
Native Americans on the tribe started doing that,
It was
like,
efficient. You can't deny it. It was efficient.
it was very efficient.
it's very efficient. And I have like nothing. I mean, yeah, I have no opinion on that whatsoever in a negative context. But like, it's just interesting. I know we're getting way off base, but this is not where we wanted to
I
head
don't
at
know
all.
that we
but-
even started with a base. We have covered social engineering. We have covered. We're 35
I know,
minutes
so
in.
I have a list. So Len sent me a list of like things he'd like to talk about
it's just
today.
like a
One of
shot
them
up
was like
from rough
traditional
right now.
hunting and harvesting in Alaska and the Navajo Nation, Navajo medicinal practices. Now we're talking about like vegans and Standing Rock. So,
Yeah.
so
I mean, I think the big thing is that what I'm seeing now, like, in it's sort of an evolving conversation in the hunting community, is like how deeply spiritual some of these practices can be, and how important it is for like connecting different generations together. Like
Yeah.
these are, you know, it's a social cohesion that happens when you go out and hunt, and like that's a real thing.
and it's
you know,
happening
that's a real
for
thing.
me as much as it is anybody. I guess that's where I'm
Absolutely.
getting at. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's connected me more to nature. It's connected me more to my family. You know, and ethics get squishy.
Mhm.
You know, but it's kind of one of those things that I just wish that everyone would give themselves the space to sit back and look at something in its context rather than instantly judge. And that goes to every side of the aisle on every
Yes.
issue. I'm calling out all humans on that, including myself, because I'm guilty of it.
Oh yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah,
So-
it's true. I think, you know, it's something I grew up kind of just assuming that's how all people related to nature.
I'm the same
And
way. I didn't know any differently either. Yeah.
I didn't know. It's like, oh yeah, what do you mean? Like, you don't hunt your, or what was the question? I remember it was like, what do you mean you don't know where your meat comes from? Like,
Yeah, right? Do you know where your tofu comes from? So, and I have no. I'm not judging anyone for their lifestyle and their diet of choice, but like you have to
No.
have an honest conversation and be honest with yourself. You know. So.
You know, I think one of the places where that's been really interesting about that particular topic is in like Arctic Alaska, where I worked in. North Slope, Alaska. It's flat. It's tundra. Like the most like basically the most productive and nutritious sources of food is sea mammals, like
Exactly.
whale and walrus and
Yep.
seals.
If
And-
if someone took a YouTube video of me shooting a whale, I'd be shot in my sleep tonight. Promise.
I
You
mean,
know.
there was a whole backlash in what was it, St. Paul Island. There was a young man that was learning how to be a whaling captain, and you know, St. Paul, there's no trees on that damn island.
No.
Like there's not, like, whales are what they have to eat, and the thing is that in St. Paul it's the cheapest thing to eat too, and it's nutritious. Like it's the
Yeah.
only source of vitamin C that you can get. Like, so that's why people don't get scurvy in
Mhm.
northern Alaska.
Oh yeah.
But this young man from Gamble got a whale, and the amount of hate mail and chastising that he got from like folks and organizations that, you know, are against whaling. I mean, it was unreal. Like the kid like was contemplating suicide. I'm like, geez, is that really?
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like, there's this emotional attachment to nature, and I think there should be.
Mhm.
But what's
But
confusing
they
is
have to have emotional attachment with context.
Yeah, I was gonna say what's
Yeah.
confusing to me is that there's an emotional attachment attachment to nature that most of those people have never experienced.
Yeah.
It's
It's a
fantasized.
romanticized idea of
It's
Yeah,
nature.
it is a
fantasized. It's not
romanticized
even
idea.
romanticized. By romanticizing something, you have to have some
Right.
pre-existing knowledge of it. It's fantasy.
Right.
I mean, and you get into a dangerous
I had
place.
an analogy
with
for
fantasy.
romanticization and fantasy, but that takes me back to my prepubescent years. But good proceed.
Jenny McCarthy.
That was a fantasy. The bug-toothed girl next to me, that was romanticized.
Yeah, it was cool working up there, and you know, I'm a pretty adventurous eater, but when they started pulling out the fermented sea mammal stuff,
Yeah.
that was pushing it. But what was cool to learn is like the reason why they fermented it is that the blubber and is basically a source of vitamins and minerals that otherwise wouldn't be available if they didn't ferment it.
Yeah.
And it's cool. I mean, that's just like, damn, that's really cool.
It is really interesting. Yeah, fermenting is one of those things. Fermentation is one of those things that has actually allowed us to survive. I mean, as a human species.
Well, and it's becoming posh now.
Yeah.
Drinking your kombucha and your kefir.
Well, and the bone broth thing blows my mind, right? Like, we got bone broth, and it's like people have been hammering bone broth forever.
Yeah, that was
right?
basic stuff for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was just like getting by food for a while.
Yeah, exactly. This is a cheesy thing. I was on a hunting survival show, and like I lived on bone broth like for 6 days, and I was never upset about it. Just boiling down grouse bones every day.
Yeah. It
kept me going, man.
I am lost in a whirlwind of stuff here.
I know.
It feels like
let's recenter here.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do that, because I was about ready to dive into a hole, and I don't know if I was ready to bring my head up. So let's refer back to your list,
to our set agenda, which we always follow here.
To the T.
I want to go talk about actually some of the Navajo medicinal practices that you grew up learning, and how those were taught to you culturally and through tradition. Because I think, like you said earlier, what's the word I'm looking for? There's the culture and there's ceremonial and all that anecdote and like all that kind of blurs together. And how was that conveyed to you, in your youth, man?
It was interesting. Like I would basically my uncle and grandparents and aunts and aunties and cousins, we would go out during breaks from school on the weekends or whatever, and just go out and collect herbs that my grandpa needed or my uncle needed for ceremonies. So it'd be different seasons, and there'd be different things that would come in, and it was just kind of going out for a hike and being told like how to what different plants were or are, what they can do, how they're prepared. It's like drinking from a fire hose the first few times.
Oh yeah.
And so we would just do one at a time. Like I remember there was this one, it's like a juniper mistletoe, I guess that's what it's called in English. But it's kind of this it's not a parasitic plant, but like a plant that grows on juniper. And,
it is somewhat parasitic, yeah. There's a word for it, but epiphytic. But anyways, there's a word for it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it grows on there, but we would use that mistletoe for like stopping bleeding after birth. And I was doing research for my class today, and one of the things that one of the active chemical compounds in there is basically the same medicine that they give to women after giving birth for the same purpose.
Anticoagulant,
Yeah. And it was cool to like connect those two pieces, but just also know like if I don't know if I really need that, or if I needed that for whatever reason, I could go find it, or whatever it may be. But there was just a lot of medicines out there that are useful, and I would just kind of learn by experience, and then the way that it also kind of the learning happened as well as through the ceremonial practices. So like in Navajo ceremonies, we have these songs about creation, and in the creation songs, they would talk about how these plants came to be.
Okay.
And so these are oral songs and traditions that have been passed on for, millennia.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, in order for something to get passed down, it has to have, I mean to be cliche, but it has to have context, and it has to have some level of like importance,
Right.
So I mean, you can almost assume that every ceremony is based in some, even if it's just an inkling of reality or an experience from someone even thousands of years prior, or wouldn't have stayed, right?
Yeah, and we had used multiple medicines. I don't even know. Like, I remember looking at my grandpa's. Like, he had this sort of bookshelf, probably as high as the ceiling, and like every shelf was filled with like every kind of medicine that was prepared and like ready to go.
That's crazy.
Well, and there's a boatload of science behind that, unintended through that cultural tradition and that exposure.
And and some of it gets proven by Western science to be like, oh shit, this is why this worked. And some of it was like, maybe this was a placebo, or just like like this is
placebos are real effects.
Placebos are still real effects.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, My wife tells me I'm handsome every day. I feel great.
At least there's someone.
Everyone's got someone, man.
Yeah, so that's how I mean, that's what the traditions I grew up with, and you know, the hunting was another piece of that as well. And we mainly hunted deer, and then we'd also like hunt prairie dogs until they got the bubonic plague.
Yeah. That's a real thing. Yeah.
So
what did hunting look like with your family? Was it? I mean, this is another thing I guess I've been asked. Like, well, Native Americans didn't hunt. It was never for fun. It was only for going to the grocery store. My wife loves going to the grocery store, by the way. But so was it like? What was it like when you went out? Was it a family thing? Was it recreation? Was it a little bit of everything?
It was like, I think with the hunting side, it was pretty serious. Like, I mean, one of the, like, if I think about like not killing something like that without intention and purpose, unless you were going to eat it, like, yeah, I mean, even stepping on an ant, like, I remember getting chastised to hell, like, for stepping on an anthill.
Yeah,
I mean, just like, they're like, you don't fuck with them. They have a role in this world that you will never understand. I was like, like as a 5-year-old, that's kind of a little bit
a little over my head there.
Yeah. But I remember that was a big piece of it. But especially in hunting and like whatever it is, it was like you never kill anything unless you're going to eat it and have very intentional purpose of doing it. And so like hunting was pretty serious, but like it's like kind of the downtime around it. We had fun like any other kids out there.
Well, the ecological context of ants is interesting, and that's what this is, I guess, where I struggle with a certain percentage of sportsmen today is if you can't hunt it and it doesn't grow big antlers, it's not worth really caring about, and that's also part of where we lose a lot of credibility as sportsmen.
Right.
With the non-hunting public, and I think that's why I think the perception of what a lot of Native people do is all right. That they have some level of appreciation and everything is done with an intent.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like, I think the thing is that the ecosystem web is very complicated, and if you start pulling on it and tugging it and fucking with different things in it, it could start messing with those other animals that people care about.
Well, and that's I hate to say that, as a wildlife biologist, my job security is great.
Yeah.
Funding may not be great, but there's always going to be a role for ecologists and biologists and almost all the ologists, because we have fucked and twisted and pulled it in so many directions that everyone says, we get this a lot, like, why are you messing with nature? Just let it be. It's like we're trying to redirect.
Yeah, we're so far beyond.
We screwed it, so we're trying to redirect the flood back into the floodplain. That's all we're trying to do. I'm not trying to. I'm just giving nature a hand to get back on course. I'm not trying to dictate it. Sometimes the public doesn't always want that.
Well, and to assume that at this point in time, we as humans can take our hands off and go, everything will be fine. I mean, is the most naive, ridiculous statement. Eventually, yes.
It's naive on a short time scale.
But on a short time scale, who knows?
Because really, like, what we don't understand is. I had a buddy talk this the other day, and he's not conservation-minded, but he said something that really surprised me. And he said, we always talk about saving nature and saving the animals. Like, the only reason I think consciously about my consumerism and recycling and all that is because I'm more worried about us.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about people. Like, nature will recover. We're going to be long gone eventually. But, like, to make sure we're still around, we are way more needy than most animals on this planet. Or all of them. We'll just say all of them.
All the landscapes that we're on today have been tended to and managed for thousands of years. Yeah. I think, there's this sense of like, oh, Native Americans live in harmony. It's like, no, like, we made nature more productive in some big ways. Like,
but every species is how do I say this? This is why. Sorry, everyone I say hunting is, if you're doing it correctly, you are part of nature. You're participating in nature, and it's the same thing. Like, when you are an even footing as a manager with nature, you take out guns and all the mechanical advantages and pesticides, and like you actually become like you are part of it. Just as you have just as much of a role as a chimpanzee in the forest. I mean, or the ants. I mean, but you have to make sure that you are flowing with that system and not trying to separating yourself from it.
Speaking of like being one with nature, so in some of our ceremonies, like, we have to use deerskin pouches to hold medicine, and they have to come from deer that have not been pierced by an arrow or a bullet. And so traditionally they used to lure deer beneath these trees, and there would be my grandfather actually was one of these people that would sit up in the tree, and then once the deer would come by, they would drop down and strangle it.
Oh. And we thought the Bomar guy who speared the black bear in Canada was...
Yeah, if I did that, I would also be very heavily chastised.
Yes. Rear naked choke a deer.
Yeah. But now, you know, it's funny now that cars have been like evolved. Now people are just picking up roadkill.
Yeah.
Nothing goes to waste, man. That's funny. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, good grief.
Yeah, exactly.
That was one my grandpa always laughed about. He's like, man, if I only had a car, I would have driven it faster.
That would have been great. No dropping out of trees, just do 65.
Yeah. It's way easier. Got the radio going. That's good, man.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. So, how many different, how do I say this? So you grew up in Arizona, and you had, I guess your mom has her, kind of her tribe. Is that a fair thing to say? Is that not culturally sensitive? How many other tribes, I guess, have you worked with, and what are some common themes that tribes are experiencing across North America in relation to these issues?
Oof. I mean, like in Alaska, I mean, it's kind of front lines of it, but like climate change is really affecting a lot of communities up there. Notably, one community I worked in, Fort Yukon, the rivers aren't freezing like when they should be. They're freezing like a month and a half later. And what that's causing is it's really hard for people to get around. Like wintertime in Alaska is the easiest time to get around because you can get on a snow machine, you can cross big distances. But if the river's not frozen or if it's not safe, then communities get stranded.
Well, I'm assuming too, back to that, it costs more time and money to live in that traditional sense in Alaska.
Yeah.
You know, even like the boat. I'm assuming at one point in time, you know, obviously well densities were higher historically, but they were probably even closer to shore based on, you know, water currents and. Yeah, I'm speaking a little bit beyond my expertise.
There's that. The other is like there's a number of tribes like that have come into conflict with states' managements of hunting and fishing regulations and regimes. Like, you know, I was talking with the folks in Fort Yukon, and they were talking about how, you know, the state of Alaska is, you know, they had I don't know the seasons up there. They're a little different, but it was like September and October was like bird season for them, like duck season. But traditionally for the Gwich'in, it was actually in the spring.
Oh, okay.
And so, you know, it kind of you know, they've been butting heads with the Alaska Department of Natural Resources for a long.
I applied for a job in Alaska that I did not get when I was first out of school. I was definitely not qualified, but I did a bunch of research for the position, and I'm trying to remember the acronym. But long story short is, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a program. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a program in Alaska that allows Native Americans to basically take, you know, threatened species, species of greatest conservation need, those types of species because of historical, cultural context. And those are really interesting programs.
Yeah.
But you're right, though, and I know there was, and when I interviewed for the position, the guy was like, be prepared to be hated because you're coming as an outsider to try to apply like modern scientific management principles to
historically
relevant like, cultural harvest methods, times of harvest, you know, and it so like I'm glad I didn't get it because I've been way over my head at that. I was like 23. I've been way over my head.
It's pretty crazy. I mean, like there, and then in Colorado, there's some things that have happened there around that. I mean, Colorado's a little different though, like in terms of states. Like what was really cool to see is that the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, like, and the tribes work very collaboratively together because of the Ute tribes there have off-reservation hunting and fishing rights. And so the tribes can issue basically tags on private land, even if they so chose. And they haven't done that, but basically the state has to adjust their numbers according to what the tribe does, and it's kind of forced them to work together. And what's been really cool is that they have a really productive and like respectful relationship with each other because they're working as partners. And
are you seeing some of that south of Canada in the continental U.S. also? Because I know we've talked quite a bit about Alaska.
That was Colorado.
Oh, that was Colorado. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was stuck on Alaska still.
Disregard.
Yeah, I was lost.
Yeah, it's just kind of a different context in Alaska, where the state Department of Natural Resources is dealing with whale tags, or I mean, there's stuff there, and I think it's sort of the challenge is now is that tribes have thousands of years of this sort of applied knowledge, and Western science in many ways provides useful information as well. And I think the big challenge now is how do you get those two knowledge sets to like braid together and play nicely when you're making policy.
Well, and the only way that can really happen is if both members are at the table.
Well, and all stakeholders at the table have a similar end game in mind, and that the end game is it outlives us.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
totally.
To have a definitive date on an end game is going to be what's crippling more than anything, and I think that's what we see from some of the short-sightedness of politics across the West and across the U.S. in regards to conservation.
And I think that's one of the hardest things with conservation now. Living in humans we're by nature instant gratification beings, but especially now with technology and long election cycles, 4 years, maybe 6, I guess, and fiscal quarters. I mean, Adam is a financial consultant, and nature doesn't work that way. And to budget in conservation is hard because I think most managers are actually fighting that. They're fighting the fiscal end of being able to get things done.
They're fighting the immediate for the long-term gain.
Because it's hard to get someone who's get elected because all they're looking at is how do I look good for my next re-election, not will my great-grandkids look up to me.
Right.
And I wish that we as a society would kind of readjust our yardstick for success.
Right.
Especially in regards to nature.
Especially in regard, but even just politically and fiscally. I wish quarters were actually 10 years.
Yeah.
I think that we would just think a lot differently as a society, and we would be a lot better off. But I'm just an ant in an anthill getting stepped on by Len.
No, because he got chastised.
Oh yeah, he learned.
He learned.
I'm an ant too. God damn it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, tribal politics are even better. They're not.
No, politics are politics.
Well, people are people.
Yeah.
I just think, I think the more time, I think those values come when people spend more time outside. Like the more time people get in these places, it just happens naturally. So.
Yeah, you're right, and that's a very noble mission. So, how do you measure success on that? What's your yardstick for measuring success on that?
Oh man, I think in my classes, it's just kind of setting small yardsticks of just if I can inspire a couple students in the class to get outside. One of the things I've been telling students is we have these kind of small in-class participation projects, and I say just get outside this week and take a photo of where you went and write a little story about it. 1 sentence. That's all that you need to do.
Just start a selfie competition and just as many selfies with bears as you can get. Yeah, and I've been noticing that too. It's but that's the other thing too. I've been seeing I guess more and more kids, I should say, or just people in general starting to take selfies.
You're getting old, Chris.
Getting old. Damn it, man. It's no one wants to get old, but no one wants to die. So here I am.
Yeah, exactly.
But are you making sure you're present,
Yeah.
Right.
While you're there? And I think that that's one of my biggest recommendations for people. If I want you to go on a trip, but I don't want to know about it. If I know about it, you've kind of bastardized the process.
That's such a catch.
But you still gotta
you
still got to commercial, put a little bit of a commercial to get someone else to start the fire, right?
The hope is that if they continually, repeatedly do it, they might forget their phone eventually.
Yeah, eventually. Okay, good call. Good call.
That's such a catch-22 because in today's age of communication, one of the best ways, first-person ways to pass on that desire or appreciation or love of the outdoors is through sharing it. And there's an obvious social media business and economy centered around it. There's an obvious YouTube economy centered around it. I think this weekend is the Western Hunt Outdoor Expo and the Pacific Northwest Outdoor Expo. Sheep shows going on. And all of these entities are tied into a lot of immediate gratification and publicizing those experiences. But going back to what both of you said, leave the phone at home. Be present.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm notorious for being present when I get outdoors.
Well, my favorite thing I get right now is like when you go out, or when people are out taking their selfies and they take a picture like, spot scope, this is my knife, like idolizing their equipment, like their brands, almost like their brand is their culture. That's another really weird thing to me too.
Right.
Sorry, I'm getting way off.
I mean, I think I took like 7 pictures this year in my entire hunting season, from the 1st of September through the 20th of December when I shot my cow elk. I think I took 7 photos. Yeah. And I thought that was like the best year I've ever documented.
When we very first started this podcast, we all got together and we're like, okay, there's a lot of these hunting celebrities. Some of them are faking it. Some of them are pretending they're way more than they are. Some of them are legit. There's a whole mix, right?
Right.
And Lee, this was kind of his brainchild, was like, we just got to show people that we're true mountain trash, man. Like this, we're educated rednecks.
And the first rule of mountain trash is you leave your phone at home.
Yeah, exactly. But then he was like, well, and I ended up being in charge of social media. It's like, dude, I can't buy any street cred, because street cred comes through digital media in this day and age.
Yeah, it does.
And like, I honestly have photos of maybe 10% of the hunts and or animals I've taken.
And I'm even worse than that.
Yeah. So like, but you got the other people, they take, like 10 or 15 trips a year, and it's photos start to finish, but that's how how someone without any context, because just due to lack of it through social media, that's their yardstick for measuring your efficacy as an outdoorsman. So it's like this shitty deal to be in.
It's a weird cultural evolution that's taken place.
So much the more photos, and just so for people listening, the more photos you take of yourself and the more animals you take, like I almost start. It's like the romanticization, or what's the word we decided? It's not the
fantasizing.
It's like the fantasization of like who you are. Like I know enough to know that it's not like that all the time.
Yeah.
Like then I start calling bullshit on you.
Yeah.
But I have context.
Yeah, it's true.
Yep.
I mean, I think one of the things that's been really cool is just I've been out in the winter quite a bit, and your phone dies, and it's like, oh yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of since I'm teaching younger students, like their world, like the generation just below me, like their world is really different, and it's like it's kind of an interesting thing, because like the world they live in is on their phones, and it's like, how do you? I'm trying to bridge that gap of like, how do you then? You got to
bridge that gap, and you've got to bastardize the device at the same time.
Yeah. Well, or like you got to use that against them or for them, I should say, maybe.
Use it for them to show it's against them.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I've been using quite a bit on my phone is like Caltopo. I do a lot of backcountry skiing, so it's been helpful there.
What is it? Sorry, I missed that.
Caltopo.
I'm not familiar.
It's like just a really versatile mapping app. You can like map hunt like private and public lands or whatever it may be. But the thing I've used it for primarily is like slope angle shading to avoid like avalanche runouts.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
But it's like been a really cool tool, and I've there's a couple students I've talked to that have really just enjoyed like going out and seeing what's out there. You can like get mining claims even. There's all these like layers you can put on the
crazy.
So, it's a pretty crazy thing.
Yeah, when I've been seeing like the Google Earth crowd too, it's I've seen younger kids in some of my spots, like not easy to get to places, and I'm like, how'd you find this? Oh, I Google Earthed it.
Yeah.
It took me 6 years to find that spring.
Yeah.
But finding the spring was awesome, but like all the adventure I had trying to find that spring and the misadventure, they lost that entire opportunity. Like they've lost the journey. Like there's a map to everywhere now, and I think what's exploration with a map? I hate to say that, but like
The best way to remedy that is decrease the resolution the deeper you get from a trailhead. So trailhead's like super high resolution.
Yeah, like you can find your way to Starbucks. After that, you're screwed.
Yeah,
man.
but every quarter mile down the trail, it just gets grainier and grainier and grainier.
Yeah, right. It's like
is that a meadow or a parking lot?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a tool and it's also a curse, and I think that I hope the generation below me figures out how to use it as a tool and not something that will curse them for the rest of their life.
Yeah,
or a crutch, because it is a crutch. Totally. It's a dependency issue at some point, because it is so readily available. I mean, and accurate information is readily available. So it does turn into a crutch. You as an outdoorsman, you lose that familiarity with the land and with the landscape and with the flora and fauna when you've got cell phone service on every top of the ridge.
You also lose it when you're going 45 on a razor.
Yes.
I mean, like, you can't. You have to go, like you said, like noticing that anthill and like the intricacies of like those little like connections just on like a micro level is like lost at speed.
Yep.
And I think that's another thing that's been lost. It's like
it really is.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting.
I mean, just like navigations, being able to like read landscapes and all of that. Like that's. I don't know. I mean, I was very fortunate to like still have those skills, but man, like.
Someone was telling me, don't quote me, I mean, you could quote me on this, but someone was telling me that during the Super Bowl they asked some, I don't watch sports, but some announcers, like, which way the sun set on some, like, trivia question, and he didn't even know which direction the sun set. And I was like, what?
What?
Like, you're playing dumb to make me feel good, or, like, so, but.
CTE.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're like North Slope, Alaska, that's a legitimate.
What do you mean, south?
It has to rise before it sets.
Yeah, that's funny as hell. So, I've been following you on Instagram a little bit since we crashed at your house. You're a busy man. Like you're not just working, you're playing. How do you fit it all in? Like every time
not married, no kids is going to be my first assumption.
Nah, that's probably fair enough.
No kids, 2 dogs, girlfriend, but yeah, I mean, it's like I just time manage. So I went to OR, put all my meetings in the morning, and basically prioritized to like then make a very slow drive back to Arizona, which involved a lot of skiing. So
absolutely.
I think it's been, the other piece is just it's been really fortunate to make a lot of friends with, folks that, are more skilled than I am in different things. And so I get to go out and get scared with them on going on mountains and stuff.
No, you're right. Like everyone you meet knows something you don't, and you have to take advantage of that, man.
Totally. And, I worked in a desk job in the DOE in the Department of Energy, and like I sat behind a desk and I did that for a year and a half, and I just realized like I can't do that. Like I have to be outside, and I'm very fortunate to work in like the outdoor industry and hunting industry that like you can make that excuse like, sorry, I'm like outside doing
gotta do some R&D, I'm taking a week
for sure. So
I call it field research.
There you go.
My wife does not buy that. She's like, is it paying you? And I'm like, no.
There's food in the freezer. That's a form
exactly. I fill the freezer every year.
Right.
So do you do any hunting at all? Like, I mean, do you fit that in?
I mean, since coming down here, I'm gonna pick up bird hunting. I haven't done it in about a year or so, but I mean, it's been a lot of traveling. I've been trying to get my mountain skills up. I just learned how to ski 2 years ago. So.
Well, you're on some. Like I grew up skiing. You're skiing some of the gnar, brah. Like you're in some serious stuff. Yeah. When you're roping into the drop-in, you're on some stuff.
Yeah, it's true. But yeah, so I got into that and just trying to like break into that piece a bit. But the last hunt I did was up in Alaska in Fort Yukon. We were looking for moose, which is really cool. But we also, man, like I every time I go back there, it's just kind of drawing me more and more to go just spend more time. We went ostensibly to go hunt moose, but we brought a shotgun and fishing poles because we knew we would see some birds and we would probably go fishing as well. And got all of the above.
Nice.
But yeah, that was the last time I was out, and it was like 2 weeks out in Fort Yukon on the Yukon River, and right at the end of moose season there. And yeah, it was, geez, man, it's special. And I just I hadn't been on that sort of hunt in probably about 3 or 4 years before then, because I was out on the East Coast, and
yeah, for sure.
Man, like I just realized like how much I took for granted how easy it was to go hunt where I'm from.
Yeah.
And man, I regret every minute of that now, of like not doing that more, or not coming home and doing that more and keeping those skills up. And so now, in Southern Arizona, I'm pick up bird hunting and also do some Coues deer stuff if I can find the time. But
like it or not, I'll be on your floor maybe again next.
Yeah,
we had an absolute blast. But and then Alaska's a place that I've never been. So if anyone listening wants to sponsor me to a trip to go up there and just be another average hunter, I would love to go there. I like
ditto said request.
God, it's been on the bucket list for so long, and like every time I'm about ready to make it happen, it just something falls through, or we can't get a pilot. I mean, like it's never happened. But Wyoming's not a bad place to play either. So
no, and I'm constantly I constantly realize you were talking about taking things for granted, Len. As someone who's grown up in, and I think you could include Montana, you could include Idaho, you could include a lot of parts of Colorado, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, in that area that everything's at our fingertips or out our back door at the absolute worst.
Right.
So living in the East Coast or the Midwest, where 99% of everything is privately owned, that's a concept that...
Well, and it's changing. A lot of those folks are moving here, and I've liked everyone I've met, but I'm still like, can I like trade you for my neighbor and send him back? I might this like no net gain policy.
In 2017, Wyoming lost 4,400 people or something like that. So we were at net loss.
We broke even, I guess.
Yeah, broke even. Yeah, I mean, in Pennsylvania, that's where I went to grad school, and it was just tough. Just living in Pittsburgh, and there's state game lands, but it's not like the big landscapes that you get in the West, and it's not like I never felt inspired going out there, and I think that's part of being at home in Arizona.
Well, I was going to say you had a predefined experience already.
Totally.
And because we've talked to several people that have come from Pennsylvania in terms of their public land, and it's available. Those experiences are still legitimate. They're still adventures. Just because they're a quarter mile instead of 7 1/4 miles doesn't change anything.
Totally.
But that's why. Sorry, Adam. You're going to say what I'm going to say, I'm sure. But.
Just that when we apply our own cultural experiences to a different landscape, that's where probably the area that line gets grayed even worse and more detrimental to the conversation.
Well, like taking things for granted. Like I said, like everybody I've met that's come from those parts of the world that are living out here in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, etc. They show up, man, and like I either really like it. I guess there's a few I don't like, but for the most part, I like them. And most of those guys and gals are involved in this conservation conversation. Or my buddy who grew up on the bar stool sitting next to me since we were since we were 21 or whatever, he's like, shit, I mean...
He's never had to be involved in it.
He's never had to be involved in it. It's always been there. And
right.
But even that person who I grew up with in small town Wyoming, USA, can't wait to go to Alaska or to Africa, to some of these other big wild landscapes that have that that energy and that power, but they're still not standing up as sportsmen
in their own backyard
to conserve. Well, but not even some of those places.
Yeah,
you know what I'm getting at? Like, how many of your friends are upset about would be upset about massive drilling in Alaska and the North Slope where they'd love to go kill a Udall sheep because due to the experience and the vastness and the magnitude. I'm telling you, it's low. I mean, I'm gonna lose friends over this, but that's fine. Like facts don't make friends. I'm fine. I'm figuring out, but that's where I'm at. Like these places warrant protection. Whether you're a fisherman, a photographer, or even if you never even want to leave your apartment, like those places warrant protection just as much as the small little 50-acre parcel in Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
totally. And I think that was one of the learnings I had to come to terms with is these places matter no matter how big or small they are. And I think that was
it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, it's been, but yeah, I think that was one of the cool things of connecting with folks that, grew up and doing that, living there and working that land,
Yeah.
Which was different than me. And I just,
Sure.
looking back, it's like, man, I should have done that.
Yeah, you should have.
I really should have done that.
Well, I'll throw this out there, Len, in return for me sleeping in your basement the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
You're more than welcome to come out and chase elk or antelope with us. We'll take you
I'd
we'll take you
love
on a fun
to.
trip, man. We have a lot of fun.
I would love to. I mean, it's something that I'm picking up more and more. I enjoy skiing. I enjoy that stuff. But like at the end of the day, like I'm looking at those things more as being able to move through landscapes.
Yeah.
And being able to like then go hunt and like being like able to use these skills of moving through the land, like how easily this animal.
Mating said this, I think, on a couple of podcasts we've done with him. It's a very similar effect. He said that, I've been ultra running and rock climbing, and like hunting is the pinnacle because I have a chance to put all of those skill sets together. But our physical prowess to even be able to do all that comes from the fact that we grew up in nature, having to run run from and to chase down. So
totally. I was talking to a pro skier recently. His name's Cody Townsend, but he does crazy stuff, and he's wanting to go to Alaska, and he's like talking about wanting to connect deeper through the land through hunting. And it's really cool to hear it from someone like him that I never never imagined someone like him talking about this.
Yeah.
But, for him, even though his whole identity is built around skiing, at the end of the day, it's like, that's how he views hunting, is it's this pinnacle of a lot of different skill sets. And he sees that it's one of them. I don't know how he's going to combine the skiing part with it.
Well, maybe this is a place to circle it back to the whole public lands and conservation movement part of the conversation, is that without those available resources that are there for every citizen, doesn't matter if you live in downtown Detroit or downtown Du Bois, Wyoming, you have those same BLM Forest Service state land parcels that are there for you to go use and experience, and not just to traverse through, but to participate in.
So I agree with you completely on that, and I do. But the other thing is when you go to these other places, you have to also appreciate and understand the cultures in which you're going to.
Absolutely. And
that's the complaint I get, and I even feel to an extent here. If you're going to move from said metropolis to said western state, and you want that culture to be the same culture you came from, whether it's, I'm not saying every culture has some rough edges that they could work on. I'm not saying that's not a true statement, but be appreciative of the culture you're moving to. And I think that's where I get from like the local small town USA boys is like, you come here from California and you want to make it like San Francisco. You're not in San Francisco. Like
But there's ways to marry the two. I mean, so First Light did a YouTube series about a bow hunter outside of Washington D.C. and this guy knocks down close to 100 deer a year. And he's an archery hunter, and he's hunting these little 2.5 acre ranchettes and farmettes in the wooded areas outside of Washington D.C. because these deer become pests, and that's marrying both of those cultures. I mean, that is talk about a metropolitan area that, other than being a political, either quote unquote swamp or whatever you want to call it,
but moving somewhere else and being upset about their hunting heritage and trying to squash that.
Well, he's bow hunting in the back of congressional.
I'm not saying him per se. I'm just saying other individuals.
And I'm saying there is a place where different cultures can marry successfully, but it can't be just because I've got a bigger sledgehammer, mine's the one that's right.
Yeah.
You've got to find the right peg to fit the right hole.
Noticing here in the West, I mean, dude, we could go on forever. We don't have to shut our mouths just like once I get going, but you come out here and you're against hunting per se.
Right,
but you have no problem building,
a 6,500 square foot
summer home in the middle of crucial winter range for mule deer. Like, and that's where I'm getting at. It's like you got to have those honest conversations with yourself. I mean, you've indirectly killed more mule deer than I probably will in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah,
ethical or not.
I see that living here in Tucson with the amount of Tucson not so much, but like Phoenix, how many grass lawns there are. I'm like, that doesn't.
Oh man.
That doesn't happen.
I'm
It's
that
not
guy in the
supposed to
neighborhood
happen.
who's like, no, if I had my way, it'd be sagebrush. You're lucky I mow
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I mean I think that's a big piece of, just like minimizing your impact in L&T is like also just how you relate to a landscape. If you're gonna parcel out, these big tracts of land that will like impede movement of animals, like that's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's not just your opinion. That's reality.
Yeah.
Like that's factual. And we've even seen in the like growth for the sake of growth's sake is where I'm struggling with humanity right now. But
yeah,
that's an entire aside.
I was going to say that's a societal mindset that is going to be that genie's out of the bottle.
Well, I was looking at some stats today, and there was like 4% of the world's population are indigenous people, but 80% of the world's biodiversity exists in the places where indigenous people live.
That's like amazing.
But part of it is there's this thing about the ways in which we relate to nature and like how important that is. When I think about like on the Navajo Nation where I live, a lot of where we generally like don't live in like basically parceling out land, like most of the res is actually open range.
Yeah.
And it's, it sucks if you're a car driver because we basically hit like cows and deer and elk all the time. But
for ceremonies.
But that's been one of the cool things about going home is just like there's no like it's just the landscape. It's kind of it feels unfettered by people. And then you go, off into Utah or Arizona and it's just like there's barbed wire fences everywhere. And it's just kind of
the scary thing for me is that it's just the landscape mentality is becoming a fantasy. It really is with the mindset of development for development's sake, growth for growth's sake.
But like you were saying, like the fences, you always hear people tout, home of the brave, land of the free, and if you really look at where you can and can't move through your own country, it's not very much. Like how free are we really? Like and I'm getting at back to the fences on the landscape. If
it's like a freedom. What is it? Freedom from rather than freedom to. I guess it's like,
and out here in the West, we have a lot of landowner. I mean, due to there's a whole history here with the range wars and cattle ranchers and sheep ranchers, and a lot of culture that's kind of driven that parceling. But even when livestock producers that are doing good land management through livestock, because they can be synonymous, where they do have fences, what they're still trying to do is still replicate natural movements as they would have had happen naturally in the prairie. They're moving things from pasture to pasture. They're from, what I'm getting at, like there's a rest rotation. So we're still trying to like mimic nature with fences. It's a weird thing. Yeah. It's a weird thing.
I think it's like, like Native people did that too. I was just talking, like there was a British Columbia, like there's all these piles, like rock gardens where they would basically create the pristine environments for like clams and shellfish to grow.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And so like they're rock gardens that have existed there for millennia, but like, it's like, that's kind of hot wiring nature a little bit to get food. But
this is not for food, it's for economics. I mean, you could argue that beef production is for food, but it's, but that doesn't happen at the cost of other wildlife, I guess.
Totally.
Then that's kind of like that's where I'm at, and like I said, I'm not coming off against livestock production at all because there's a lot of ranchers that do great work and that are super good stewards of the land, and a lot of this talking about urban development and urban sprawl. There's a lot of habitat in this country that is privately owned. That if they couldn't afford the ranching lifestyle and couldn't do that, it would most likely eventually be subdivided and be a city.
Well, you can take...
So the argument's really noisy.
You can take states like Nebraska and Texas and Iowa and Illinois that are far beyond the vast majority privately owned.
Right.
In the 90s, high 90s of percentiles are privately owned and still have incredibly viable populations of white-tailed deer and wild turkey and mule deer and elk and mountain lions and black bear. I mean, and these are. But
is the opportunity there to promote the sport and to promote the tide of the land outside of those private? I said, the argument gets really noisy.
It does get noisy, but and you can always go back to it. Without those spaces, those populations don't exist to even have the argument in the first place.
True, but if everybody was experiencing them, there'd be someone to protect it. Maybe you wouldn't need it. I'm just like chicken or the egg hypothesis, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Europe is like kind of we're kind of facing the challenges that Europe is already starting to deal with, like basically landmass that's getting more and more people and like subdivided, and they're making it work. There's challenges for sure, but I think it is a question of values of like what works and what makes sense, and it's it's politics mess. It's kind of I think at the end of the day though, it's like if there's a sort of a common consensus that like taking care of this land matters, and it matters not just for us but everyone coming after us, I think that as a starting point is a much easier I think then these discussions are like, they're hard, but like I think also there's opportunities for collaborative outcomes.
No, I agree, and that's what I'm trying to get at though. It's not this like all or nothing approach, and that it's easy to look over the fence and judge somebody, but like you said, like as long as you're both looking over the fence at each other and having a conversation, that's what needs to happen.
Totally. Yeah, the great thing. That's like you're totally talking about my research now. It's like, how do you get various stakeholders to talk together about these common issues? So
yeah, and we not intentionally so with the podcast kind of are trying to do that, and just trying to start a conversation. Like the intent of this effort is just to put maybe some facts in the hands of people so they can make their own decisions, but make them better informed, and not to tell people what to think, but kind of how to think. And I don't know. I don't know what I'm.
Well, maybe not even how to think, but what to think about.
Well, yeah, but I guess like what to think as far as
directing some context.
Think critically. Try to pull your emotion out first. Like that type of stuff. Like
the best message would be to abandon any absolutism, because that's where we get ourselves into this team red, team blue, team green, whatever.
So
and as far as absolutism goes, birth and death are about all you can count on. I mean, that whether you want to admit it or not.
Well, and everybody, I think, in present company included, everybody needs to sit back and give themselves just enough space to just even consider for the fact that everything you think is wrong. Maybe not even everything. Maybe if it's just one thing.
Right.
Even if it's what your favorite cereal is, that's a great practice, or what the best beer is. Like, sit back and just give yourself to think that, like, hey, there's probably some things I think that aren't right, and how can I change that? So.
Is it don't believe everything you think, or something like that?
Yeah. And don't say everything you think.
Yeah.
Rather, don't say everything you feel. I'd rather hear about what everyone thinks and what they feel.
A comedian the other day on HBO or something, and he was like, everyone in here getting judgy as shit. If everything you thought today was said out loud, none of you would have jobs tomorrow. Like, true that. Well, thank you, Len. We really want to, I guess we're really appreciative you came on the podcast and gave us a chance to talk. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. I'd love to have you on in the future. I'm sure Adam and Lee and Sam would as well.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to keep doing it.
I mean, you think of anything you want to come on and use us as a sounding board or a platform, and we'll have you on. You're brilliant. We appreciate the effort. And it's like I'm always comforted to meet like super smart, intrinsically motivated, passionate folks. And it's easy to think that they're not around until you kind of leave the comfort of your own backyard. So kudos.
What's that saying about you? With that, Roamers.
My fence has been blown down for a month. My neighbors love me. So.
Well, I'm going to make my way up there hopefully within the next year, so I'll let you know.
Absolutely.
All right, well, thank you so much, Len, and thanks again, guys, for stopping in to give us a listen here at the Right to Roam podcast. If you have a chance, give us a rating or review, like or subscribe, all the standard BS you hear from everybody, but it's true, it really matters. It helps us grow, it helps us get the message out, and we need you more than you need us, I promise.
Share this or your favorite episode.
All right, take care, folks, and happy trails.
Thanks, Len.
Hey, take care, guys. Chat soon.
Yeah, thanks, Len.
Thanks for listening. Watch your top knot.
The views, statements, and opinions expressed by the hosts in this podcast are strictly their own and do not represent a position or stance being promoted by a state or federal management agency unless otherwise specified.